The Gilker clan originated in the Hanover province of the Kingdom of Prussia. Louis Gilker, or Gulker, as it was then spelled, was born in Prussia in 1815, and his wife Mary, who was also born in Prussia in 1827, both came to the United States and settled in Scioto County, Ohio, in the southern part of the state. Louis and Mary were farmers in Bloom Township and raised several children, one of whom was Henry F., who was born in 1861. Henry met Josephine Borgadine, who was born in 1872 and had emigrated to the U.S. as an indentured servant in 1890. Henry hired Josephine to cook at and clean the pool hall he owned in Mount Adams at 955 Pavilion Street. They were married in 1896. Soon, there were two boys born, Victor in 1897 and Aloysius in 1901. Fearing that the atmosphere of a pool hall would not be good for the boys, Henry and Josephine soon converted it to a grocery store. There were two churches at the top of Mount Adams, the Church of Immaculata, which served the German population, and Holy Cross Church, which served the Irish. Vic went to Immaculata Grade School and then went to Woodward High School, where he was nicknamed Tony and graduated in 1915. Vic began college in pre-med, but after an argument with his parents, he enlisted in the Army in 1916. He was deployed to Texas during the campaign against Pancho Villa and then became part of the American Expeditionary Force that fought the Germans. In the last letter he wrote to his parents before shipping out, he wrote, "Will you call Avon 2298-2 and tell Catherine that we have sailed? You will remember her. She is the one who was over when I was on my furlough." Frederick Tising was born in 1826 in Hanover, and his wife Magdalena was born in 1825 in Baden, Prussia. It is not known when they emigrated to the United States. Charles Tising was born in 1851 in Cincinnati, one of 8 children of Frederick and Magdalena. Charles J. Tising was born in Cincinnati on November 3, 1874, the sole child of Charles. Like his grandfather Frederick, he was a shoemaker, but later drove a butternut bread truck. At some point, he met Mary Ellen Connors, who was known as Ella and born in April of 1877. Ella's mother, Ellen Ryan Connors, was born in County Cork, Ireland. She came to America as an indentured worker, bearing her coffee set, and married John F. Connors, who had also come from Ireland and was a carpenter. Charles J. and Ella were married in early 1900 and moved in with Ellen, who was widowed. In August of 1900, their first child, Catherine Cecilia, was born. She was followed 3 years later by Ruth and 17 years later by Charles, known as Junior. Charles and Ella bought a house on Whittier Street, and Catherine, or Kate as she was called, grew up there. Kate had an uncommon aptitude for piano and attended the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music for 2 years. She worked downtown at Woolworth's selling sheet music and performing it for customers. She also performed in several theaters playing music for silent films and in an all-girl band on the island Queen. For a while, she worked for a vocal style company making player piano rolls. During World War I, Kate volunteered with the Red Cross. Franz Grothaus was born in Germany on October 6, 1844, and came to the United States in 1864. Franziska Fischer was born in Münster, Westphalia, Germany on August 3, 1851, and came to the United States in 1866. They both settled in northern Kentucky. It's not known how they met, but they were married in 1874. Franz, or Frank as he was called in the U.S., was a shoemaker until the early 80s when he bought a saloon in downtown Cincinnati and he moved the family to Cincinnati. He and Franziska, or Francis, had 7 children: Franz Jr., Hermione, Eva, Fanny, Leo, Joseph, and Walter. Unfortunately, Francis died in 1901 and Frank died in 1906, leaving the 4 youngest orphaned and below 20. Although all the Grothauses did well, Leo became president of Charleston Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, and Johnny Walter, the son of Walt, was the captain of the 1949 Notre Dame National Championship football team. Joseph was born in 1888 and baptized at St. Philomena Church. He was 17 when his parents died. He lived with various relatives and went to work first as a shipping clerk and then a salesman selling harnesses. When the First World War broke out, Joe and his brother Walter enlisted in the Army in July 1918 and were sent overseas with the American Expeditionary Force. John Bodie was born in Prussia in 1825. Christiana Gestricht was born in Prussia in 1830. At some point, they were married and settled in Covington, Kentucky. They had 6 children, the youngest of which was Julius, who was born June 17, 1864. Julius, as a young man, worked in a wire-making factory, but eventually became a carpenter. At some point, Julius met Mary Burns Behrens, who was born in November 1867 in northern Kentucky, and whose parents had both emigrated from Prussia. Julius and Mary were married in early 1893, and in September 22, 1893, their first child, Emma, was born. Emma eventually had 3 sisters, Elsie, Marion, and Louise, who was later to be called Tussie. Emma, until at least 1900, lived with her parents in her grandmother's house. Her parents, sometime after 1900, bought a house on Russell Street in Covington, Kentucky, and she moved there. By the time Emma was 17, she was working at a drugstore and thereafter, until at least 1920, was a sales lady at Poe's, a department store in Cincinnati. Vic Gilker was always interested in medicine, and during the war, he served as a medical corpsman. He was in the battles of Meuse-Argonne and Ypres during his service. He rose to the rank of sergeant and was discharged on April 12, 1919. Joe Grotehouse served in Europe in the Quartermaster Corps. He attained the rank of Private First Class and was discharged in July 1919. Vic and Joe returned to Cincinnati as part of the victorious American Army. It was the beginning of the Roaring '20s, and love was in the air. Vic returned to his Catherine, and Joe met Emma on a blind date that Emma was reluctant to go on, and they fell in love. Joe and Emma were married November 22, 1920, and Vic and Kate were married in 1921. Vic and Kate bought a house at 1976 Kinney Avenue in Walnut Hills, where they lived for many years. Vic worked as a mail clerk on the train traveling between Cincinnati and Chicago. On June 3, 1922, Robert Victor Gilker was born. Vic and Kate were thrilled at the dark, chubby addition. 6 years later, their second child, John E. Gilker, was born. Meanwhile, Joe and Emma first rented a place at 1824 Kinney Avenue and then bought the house at 1816 Kinney Avenue. Joe worked for LeBon Manufacturing. On February 6, 1922, Mary Jane Grotehouse was born, followed 3 years later by her sister Elizabeth, called Tinker. Robert, or Bob as he was called, went to Holy Angels School in Evanston. Mary Jean, from the other side of Kinney Avenue, went to St. Francis de Sales School. In 1937, Bob Gilker entered Purcell High School. At Purcell, Bob became known as an athlete, earning letters in track, basketball, and his best sport, football, and an artist. He was nicknamed Waddles for his distinctive method of running and had a great group of friends. Bob graduated in 1940. He was offered a football scholarship to the University of Dayton, but Vic, who valued education, would not let him go to school to play a silly game. Mary won a scholarship to St. Ursula Academy and entered in 1937. She was a good student and graduated in 1940. She was awarded a scholarship to Mount St. Joseph's College, but went to work to help support her family. One thing that happened during high school is that Mary, who grew up right up the street from Bob, met him for the first time at a Purcell High School basketball game and thought he was cute. Bob went to work for Southeast Joslin Company, selling electrical equipment, and moved to Florida. The United States entered the war at the end of 1941, and Bob tried to enlist, but a heart murmur was found in his physical, and he was turned down. Bob continued to see doctors in an attempt to join the war, and finally on September 7th, 1943, he was inducted into the Army. On December 20th, 1944, Bob left for Europe and landed in Normandy on December 31st, 1944, and immediately headed for the front. Bob was attached to the 137th Infantry Regiment and saw much action, including at the Battle of the Bulge. He earned 4 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. Finally, in August 1945, Bob boarded the U.S. Army transport Cristobal to return home. Meanwhile, back at home, Mary was holding down the home front. She found a job at WKRC, one of the top radio stations, as secretary to the general manager. It was an exciting job, and she met some celebrities. She also studied music under Franz Tregbar at the College of Music and sang in the DeSales Choral Society. While Bob was gone, he and Mary Jean kept up a lively correspondence. It was obvious that Bob had met the love of his life, but Mary was much more reticent. Once he returned to the States, Bob became more persistent, and on June 1st, 1946, Bob and Mary Jean were married at St. Francis de Sales Church.
Smiling face, a fireplace, a cozy room, a little nest.
Bob had come up for the wedding from Lexington, Tennessee, where he still worked for Southeast Joslin. After a very short honeymoon, Bob and Mary said goodbye to their families and headed back down south. They returned to Cincinnati later that year, where Mary was Purcell's very first homecoming queen. Bob and Mary first settled in Lexington, Tennessee at 105 White Street. Bob continued his work stringing power lines for Joslin and Tennessee and throughout the South. Mary Jean did not like living in the South, but persevered, and the couple found themselves in Jacksonville, Florida in 1947. On September 14th, 1947, in the midst of a hurricane, Bob and Mary Jean welcomed a beautiful addition into their family, who they named Mary Patricia. Patty, as she was called, was the first grandchild of both Vic and Kate and Joe and Emma, and they were ecstatic. Patty spent the first few years of her life as a Southerner. She was a happy and adventurous little girl and the apple of her parents' eye. Two important things happened in 1950. The family moved back to Cincinnati, and a second child was born. The family originally settled on the first floor of Mrs. Hanson's house at the corner of Wold and, of course, Kinney Avenue, and eventually bought a house at 1961 Kinney Avenue. Robert Joseph Gilker, or Bobby, was born on October 20th, 1950. Bob and Mary's family were ecstatic to have them back home on Kinney Avenue and were thrilled with the young grandson. The family settled into their home on Kinney Avenue, and Patty and her brother Bobby bonded. A mere 3 years later, on August 19, 1953, another daughter, Catherine, was born. Chubby Caffey was followed exactly 1 year later, on August 19, 1954, by Elizabeth, called Betty. Betty was named after Mary's sister Tinker, who died way too soon of cancer earlier that year. In the summer of 1954, Bobby was diagnosed with polio, which shocked and frightened Bob and Mary. and he spent the next year in the hospital. On September 24th, 1955, soon after Bobby got out of the hospital, the Gilker family welcomed a new addition, Thomas Anthony, called Tommy. Now, the family had reached its full complement of 5.
No, sir.
The Gilker family lived in St. Francis de Sales Parish, and Patty started school there. For 2 years, Bobby took the short bus to Condon School, and then he and Kathy joined Patty at the Sales. In 1959, Bob Gilker bought a pony keg on the west side of Cincinnati called Hillside Carryout. Since Bob still had a day job as a salesman, Kate, who was called Mimo, moved to an apartment down the street on Harrison Avenue to run the store during the day. Vic, called Pop, died the day before the move and so remained an East Sider for life. Not long thereafter, Bob and Mary also moved their family to the west side to 3239 Glenmore Avenue, where the family had a new parish and a new school, St. Martin's of Tours. Soon, Emma and Joe Grotehouse, known as Mem and Papa Joe, moved to the west side, and the whole family became West Siders. The Gilkers thrived in their new home. The kids became involved in school activities, and the parents made a group of new friends and became very involved with their new church.
Sort of life is what you wish. You may grow up to be a fish.
The years flew by, and the Gilker kids grew. All 5 graduated from St. Martin's School and then got ready to move on to high school. One notable occurrence during this time was that Michael Barrett came to live with the Gilkers and expanded their family. The high school years came, and the girls, Patty and Kathy and Betty, all attended and graduated from Mother of Mercy High School. Meanwhile, the boys, Bobby, Michael, and Tommy, all attended and graduated from LaSalle High School, though Bobby needed some help from summer school at West High. As Dylan sang, the times were changing, and so were the Gilkers. The kids were reaching adulthood and were touched by the spirit of the times. So were Bob and Mary. During this period, Bob quit working for others and went into business with Frank Schaefer, co-owning Schaefer Box and Pallet. Also, unfortunately, Mimo died on July 22nd, 1969, 2 days after watching the moon landing on TV. She said she had a great life growing up with horses and buggies and watching men walk on the moon. Also, Patty graduated from beauty school and became a cosmetologist. Kathy graduated from nursing school as the valedictorian of her class, and Bobby graduated from college and law school from Ohio State. In June of 1971, Bob and Mary celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a big party. Soon, the kids began to marry. First, Bobby got married in December of 1971. Betty and Jack Lindenschmidt followed on October 27, 1973. Patty and Gary Spar were married on May 8, 1976. Bobby tried again on August 23, 1980 with Karen Shoup. Kathy married Kip Monroe on March 3, 1984. Tom married Ellen Nuri on October 10, 1987. And after being together a long time, Michael and Carmen Malora tied the knot on February 14, 2002. Although Cincinnati had been the primary locale for the Gilker families for most of their time in America, this generation began to spread out. Patty and Gary moved to several cities before settling in Houston, Texas. Bobby and Karen moved to New York City and Columbus, Ohio, and finally to Ashburn, Virginia. Kathy and Kip lived in Bronxville, New York, St. Louis, Missouri, and Sterling, Virginia. Betty and Jack moved from Cincinnati to St. Louis, Missouri. Only Tommy and Mike stayed in Cincinnati. Tommy just down the street from St. Martin's. Although the family had spread out, they always found times to get together. Christmases were favorite times when Mary would organize pageants. There were some sad get-togethers, such as Papa Joe's funeral in June of 1970 and Mim's funeral in September of 1983. But there were more good times, such as when Bob performed with his beer drinking and Bible study group. In June 1982, the kids celebrated Bob's 60th birthday by organizing a surprise roast. As Bobby said,
"Yeah, a few stories. I remember a number of years ago, he said to me, he said, Bob, it's time we had to talk. Man talk. I said, Dad, you mean sex talk? I was 19. Yeah, he puts things off. We had a really nice talk. And I hope I answered your question.
In June of 1996, Bob and Mary celebrated their 50th anniversary with a big party, and they received a beautiful quilt that the family and their friends all contributed to. In October 2002, Bob, after a long illness, was laid to rest. After Bob died, the kids would get together with Mary for her birthday every year until she joined Bob in April of 2008. In addition to priceless memories, Bob and Mary left their children with a strong sense of family that they carry with them today.